Have you ever been in a situation where you were solving your own medical problems or trying to find the solutions to why you or your children were having difficulty, whether that was with nursing or trying to find a diagnosis for a difficulty that you knew in your gut had an underlying root cause? Sometimes, even as an IBCLC, I talked to somebody who I tried to help, and they tell me their story later, and I realized I missed it. I was too focused on trying to help with that one latch at that one moment that I didn't step back and look at the bigger picture. My guest today has a story that will both comfort and enrage many of us who have been in this situation. And because the month of May is Williams Syndrome Awareness Month, I wanted to share this story right away, even though we just recorded. So I bumped it up so that everyone could be made more aware of her daughter's final root cause, which was Williams syndrome. So she was not able to get this diagnosis until her daughter was almost 4 years old, but it most certainly was one of the causes of her feeding difficulties when she was a baby. So enjoy the wisdom that Kayla has to share. Even if your baby does not have a diagnosis that is impacting the feeding, much of what she went through will comfort anyone who has had difficulty feeding their baby. Hi, Kayla. Welcome to the Milk Making Minutes. I'm so glad you're here.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, so why don't you introduce yourself and your family?
Sure, so my name is Kayla. I'm a full spectrum doula, a sexual reproductive health educator, and a placenta encapsulation specialist. I live in Western Mass with my husband and our 5-year-old daughter, whose name is Daisy, and I am also currently 11 weeks pregnant with my second baby.
Yay, congrats.
Thank you.
Were you in this line of work before you had Daisy?
I was not. I
Okay.
knew when I had her, I knew almost nothing.
So the first thing I want to know about is what your exposure to baby feeding was. Like, go as far back into your memory as you can and think about your childhood and your cultural upbringing and what kind of baby feeding did you see?
Yeah, so my family is huge. I am the oldest of five. My mom had me when she was 16, and all the other people in my family, just a lot of them had kids young, not that young, but I have a huge family. I have a lot of cousins, and I feel like I was never really, even though I was around babies for my whole life, I never really saw many people breastfeeding or nursing their babies. I feel like I really only saw people bottle feeding their babies. And it's not that nobody ever talked about breastfeeding or didn't want to do it. I think it was just something they just didn't do. Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty common, I think. I'm hoping that we are all changing that narrative for our
Yeah.
kids, but for our generation at least, that's typically the story that I
Mhm.
hear. Yeah, so when was the first time that you ever became aware of the idea of breastfeeding or saw it yourself?
Honestly, I can't remember when I saw people breastfeeding. Like I always knew it was a thing because my mom was like into birth and babies, but I don't really remember her like nursing a lot of my siblings. But I always knew breastfeeding was a thing, and I knew before I had my daughter that I wanted to breastfeed, but I didn't have it in my mind that it was like this strict thing that I was like, okay, I have to do this. I had the idea in my brain of, yeah, I want to nurse her for as long as I can. And if I have to bottle feed her and formula feed her, it's not a big deal. But I did, and I wanted to, but just didn't work out that way. And it wasn't at the time, like it didn't upset me too much.
So typically, when we're preparing, we're mostly thinking about birth. But I would love to know, as you were preparing, did you do any baby feeding prep focus at all?
Yeah, so when I got pregnant with Daisy, I was 22 years old, and I decided that I was going to give birth with nurse midwives, and I was on WIC when I was pregnant with her. So through WIC, I did have one nursing body feeding class through WIC, and it was just me and my husband, and we were sitting in a room in a WIC office, and it was just a video like about what like the sucking and swallowing and latching looked like. It was when I was pregnant. It wasn't like after I had her or anything. It was when I was pregnant, but really it was just a video. And that was
Oh,
it.
yeah, yeah. They're like, "Here, come
Yeah.
watch this video. This
Yeah.
will help you."
Yeah, and like I took a childbirth class through the hospital that I had her at, but again, that was like it was such a like the class, even for me saying I didn't really know much, everything that the childbirth class that I took at the hospital was stuff that I did already know.
Honing in on how birth experience can impact baby feeding. Tell us a little bit about your birth experience and how that may have impacted your initial feeding experiences.
Sure. So back then, I had no idea that my birth experience or any birth experience could impact the way that we feed our babies. Now I know that has a lot to do with how we feed our babies and what kind of help we get and how we feel about ourselves and our ability to feed our babies from our bodies. So, my birth experience with Daisy was I was 40 weeks and 2 days, and my water broke in the middle of the night at 3 o'clock in the morning. I wasn't having any contractions at all. I was just dead asleep, laying in bed, laying on my side, and I already had a pad on. And I woke up out of my sleep and I was like, I think my water just broke. I was on Pitocin, and I didn't really know like barely any of the things that I know now. So when I was in labor with Daisy, I basically laid in bed the whole time. I never really got up. I tried sitting on the birth ball once, and I tried the gas and air once and decided that I didn't like that. So, one thing that bothers me now that didn't bother me when I first had Daisy was that I went to the hospital with my waters broken, and I had a lot of cervical exams when I was in labor
Mm.
with Daisy. If I am remembering correctly, I was having a cervical exam like every hour to 2 hours, and I was there for 21 hours, and like from the time I got there to giving birth, and I didn't know then that that's not evidence-based care, and B, like my waters are broken, so why are you checking me so often?
Mhm.
Anyways, I'm laboring. I'm laboring on the pitocin. I get to 10 centimeters, and they're like, okay, cool. Your body is doing it all on its own now. You don't need the pitocin anymore. So they shut my pitocin off. And then I remember them being like, you're 10 centimeters, so you can start pushing now. And
Mm.
I'm like, okay, cool. Like, I'll do that. And I start pushing. I have a nurse holding one leg, my husband's holding my other leg. The midwife is at the end of the bed with her hand on my belly. And I started to push, but I wasn't having any contractions. And I wasn't like afraid or scared or stressed out or anything. I was excited. I was happy to be there, happy to meet my baby, and I just stopped having contractions for whatever reason. I don't know if it was because my body wasn't doing it on its own and I did still need that Pitocin or what. And the midwife was asking me, like, can you feel her down there? And I had an epidural, but it was like I could feel, but not be like, oh, this hurts. I could just feel like a little bit of pressure. And she had her hand on my belly, and she was like, are you having a contraction? And I was like, no, I don't feel like I'm having any contractions at all. And she was like, okay, you can keep pushing if you want to. And I didn't know any better, so I was like, okay, yeah, I'm gonna keep pushing. And her head kept going down and going back up and going down and going back up. And then the next
Mm.
thing I know, she's coming out, and I'm like thinking in my head, I'm like laying there, and I'm like, why is everybody looking at me right now? And then I'm like, why am I grunting? And then I'm like, oh, the baby's coming out. Like, I better just keep doing that because it's working and the baby's coming out. And then my daughter was born, and I don't remember feeling her head or her shoulders and her body come out, but I remember feeling her legs come out. She had a short cord, and the placenta was still inside of me. And I'm like so out of it. And I try grabbing her and pulling her up, and they're like, stop. She's still attached to her cord and it's really short. Just leave her on your belly for now. And I'm like, okay, sure. I have no idea what's going on. And then I got to put her on my chest. And when she was born, she cried right away. She was healthy. So jump into my immediate postpartum in the hospital right after I had her. She had pretty bad jaundice, and I did have a fever when I was pushing her out and when she was born. So she was born with a fever and she had a mild infection. So in the room, we were there for 3 days, and she was born on December 20th, so right before Christmas. And we had her under the blue lights, and she had an IV with antibiotics for her infection. Nursing her, I did try to nurse her as much as possible. Like, I was, again, didn't really know what to do. I just tried holding her in different positions, tried to get her to latch, tried what very little I did know how to do, and was just like, okay, I'm gonna put my boob in her mouth and see what happens. I don't know. And I saw a lactation consultant in the hospital, I think once the whole time I was there. And I was like, I feel like I don't know how to really hold her to get her to latch on. I don't know if she's latching on. I wasn't sure what was going on. And it was so much in that immediate postpartum time. They were like, she has to be on the blue lights as much as possible. When you do take her out of the crib with the blue lights, you have to put her on a blue light blanket to nurse her. She didn't really get a lot of breaks the whole time that she was there with the blue lights. And we even went home with a blue light blanket. So she had 2 rounds of antibiotics through her IV, and then she bumped her IV like on her side of her crib and it came out. And so they tried to get a new IV in her so she could get her last round of antibiotics, but they couldn't get an IV back in. And so they wanted to transfer us to a different hospital in the area that had people who were maybe a little bit more like skilled in putting IVs in babies. And at the time, that just really freaked me out. And I really didn't want to go to this other hospital. And then on top of that, they had told me, like, if we transfer your baby to this other hospital, she's going to have to go in an ambulance and you and your husband will have to follow in the car behind. And that's when my husband and I both started. No, we started like freaking out. We're like, you need to figure something else out. I was like, yeah, there's no way I'm letting my baby, like, A, I don't want to go to this hospital. B, I was like, and I especially don't want her going anywhere without me. And so we made a big deal about it, and they were like, okay, we'll figure something else out. And they ended up just giving her the last round of antibiotics in a shot instead of transferring her and getting a new IV because her levels for her bilirubin, I know, her levels for her bilirubin and her infection that she had was going down and she was getting better. So they're like, okay, we'll just do that instead. Give it to her in a
I
shot.
can't believe that they were considering transferring her in an ambulance to another hospital to give her antibiotics
Mm-hmm.
for an
Yeah.
infection they likely caused
Yes.
by
Checking me so many times.
continuous cervical checks, which were unnecessary when your water had already broken, when they could have just given her shots to begin with.
So now that I'm a doula and I know everything that I know now, I look back at that experience. There are so many things that I'm like, why did they check me so many times? I didn't know I could say no. I didn't know that it was totally not necessary. And I'm like, they probably were the ones that caused her to have an infection. I'm lucky and happy that I didn't have an infection. So, yeah, I look back now and I'm like, I'm not happy with how that birth went. It could have been so different. And when I was pregnant, I was offered doula support from other people who either had partners who were doulas, or they had sisters that were doulas, or they just knew people who were doulas. And I didn't know anything about what a doula did back then. I had this preconceived notion that doulas were only for people who had money and people who wanted to have these totally unmedicated births. I didn't know back then that doulas are for everyone. Everyone should have a doula, and I didn't know that doulas supported any type of birth. And yeah, so I was like, no, we're not those kind of people. I don't think we need to have a doula. And now I'm like, oh my God, I wish I had a doula. I should have had a doula.
Right.
Because maybe
Right.
things would have been a lot different.
And sometimes you do need to work to find the right doula who you know is going to support you regardless of what choices you are going to make.
Exactly.
It's just like any other provider,
Right.
you
Yeah. There's a
know.
doula out there for everybody. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Yeah. So that was my immediate postpartum in the hospital with Daisy.
These immediate postpartum experiences, ignorant, you said that you thought your birth experience was fine when you first were processing it, but
Mhm.
then once you learned more, you looked back and then you thought, "Oh, this wasn't okay." And in so many ways, ignorance is bliss when it comes to the modern birthing system, because once people know more, then that's when they get pissed off because they realize that so much of what happens with our baby feeding difficulties and with our postpartum depression or postparanatal mood disorders is as a result of medical birthing practices that are really non-evidence based and unnecessary, and are what are causing our difficulties to begin with. And
Yes.
sometimes it's better left just to know that, okay, I am happy and healthy now, than to go digging through the trauma.
Mhm.
Sometimes we do have to let the trauma out, of course. But yeah, the fact that you experienced all of this and it wasn't until you actually realized how much of it could have been avoided that
Mhm.
you felt angry about it is pretty enlightening.
Yeah, yeah. Like at first I was like, "Oh yeah, that was a totally great and fine birth. This happens to so many people." I was like, "Oh, I had no tearing at all, not even a laceration. Like my baby was healthy in the grand scheme of things. She didn't have any major health complications when she was born." Yeah.
And
And
that's how,
then
and that's the like plumb line for how we decide whether or not our births were great or not.
mhm.
And how did this experience impact your baby feeding with all of the difficulty with the infection and the antibiotics, and even having had the pain medication? Sometimes that can make babies sleepy. So, what was happening with baby feeding through all of these rounds of antibiotics and trying to figure out how baby was going to get the care she needed?
So I was nursing her as much as possible. And the whole time in the hospital, they never gave her formula or a bottle or anything. And the hospital that I had her at was a certified baby friendly hospital. So, for people that don't know what that means, typically hospitals that are baby friendly hospitals do not give binkies or bottles. They do rooming in. They don't really take your baby to a nursery unless you like really ask them, like, hey, can you please take my baby to the nursery? And even then, they try to figure out, like, how can we get you to room in with your baby unless there's something really going on and you really do need that break from your baby. Yeah, so for a hospital that so wants you to breastfeed, I didn't really get that much support. Like, I know the nurses would try to help me figure out how to hold her because she did have the IV and she had a little, oh, it almost looked like a little cast almost, like over her arm. And she was hooked up to tubes. And at one point, she did have a little oxygen, like a little cannula with the oxygen. I have pictures of my husband holding her with that. And you can see she's hooked up to these different things. And then being on the blue light blanket when I was going to take her out to nurse her, like just wrapping her in the blue light blanket and swaddling her and having all these tubes and stuff. It was like, okay, how do I hold her? The one position that I did have the most success with was the football hold position. But again, it was just like no one was really like showing me how to make sure she was latched on, or like making sure that her latch was good. So when she would nurse, it would be for a very short period of time and then she would unlatch. And I was like, okay, let me try switching sides. But she wouldn't want to like latch back on again. She would unlatch and then that was it. Like she was done. But yeah, she was like gaining weight, peeing and pooping. She was newborns lose a little bit at first and then they gain it back. She wasn't like losing weight rapidly or anything. And she was peeing and pooping, so they never made it seem like it was a problem. So we go home on the 23rd and we had to have a blue light blanket. We had somebody come to our house and make sure we're using the blue light blanket right, set it up for us. We were camped out in our living room for that like postpartum time when we were home. And I just remember just the latching was such a big issue, and I wasn't sure if she was getting enough. We did have one visiting nurse come over one day and try to help with breastfeeding. Don't really think that it was super helpful. Like, I didn't have an assessment. If somebody would have just sat down with me and like really paid attention and really knew what they were doing and looked at how I was holding my baby, looked at how I was trying to get her to latch, looked at how she was actually eating, maybe somebody would have been like, yeah, there's some kind of issue here. There's something going on here that's not right. I don't know if they would have been able to help troubleshoot the issues that we were having. I didn't know anything about nursing or what to look out for, really. I was just like, okay, this isn't working out very well. I was pumping, not really on a schedule. I didn't know I had to be on a schedule or anything like that to keep up with my supply. I was just pumping in between when she was not nursing, and I pumped until she was about 3 months old, and my milk just dried up. She stopped latching. I was just giving her bottles and giving her formula. So she did get breast milk until she was about 3 months old, but it was a combination of formula and breast milk. And then eventually my milk dried up and we just gave her formula until she was a year old.
Yeah. So you said you had that one visiting nurse come. Did she have any lactation credentials at all? Do you know?
I don't remember, honestly.
Okay. Yeah. And when you're in that early stage and you don't even know what the difference is between the various helpers, you don't even know to ask or look for
Mm-hmm.
that. Sometimes even lactation professionals will come in and we forget to take that step back and to look at the bigger picture, and we hone in on just that one moment of this one latch that we're looking at for these 30 minutes or these 60 minutes, and we clap our hands and we say, okay, we did it, we got this latch. And then we forget that this parent has to feed this baby for every other latch from now on. And so, what are they going to do if they can't get it the next time? And how do we help them feel competent and successful? And have we set them up for a plan B or a plan C? And have we educated them so that they know who to call if it's not us? Because that visiting nurse, she probably wasn't the person to call if you were having more difficulty. So has she told you who to call if you're having continued difficulty, so that you don't feel like you're just now lost in space doing it
Yeah.
all on your own?
Yeah, and that's how we basically were, just like lost in space. Nobody ever was like, hey, let's try to get this ironed out. Let's figure out these like feeding issues.
You don't have to be lost in space figuring out your feeding difficulties all on your own. I would love to be providing the support that you need. And you know what? Sometimes your plan A isn't going to work out because feeding babies is dependent on a dyad. It's dependent on both you and your baby. But as your internationally board certified lactation consultant, I am there to help you feel really good about whatever plan you land on. And I'm there to help you feel empowered to make the decisions that are right for your family. You can reach me at www.quabbinbirthservices.com. All my information is there. And in many cases, I can bill your insurance company, or at the very least, I can provide a super bill so that you can get reimbursed. And I can meet with you in person if you're within an hour of me in Massachusetts, or I can meet with you virtually. Many lactation difficulties can be solved without me ever having to see you in person. I can't wait to work with you.
So where were you going for sources of information as you were trying to pump and feeding bottles and figuring out schedules and all of that? Where were your sources of information at that time?
I was trying to look stuff up on my own. I thought, at first I was like, oh, maybe I need a nipple shield. Maybe that will help us. So my husband, Babies R Us was still open at this time. I think they were like about to close. And my husband goes to Babies R Us, and I don't know who tried to help him or they did not know what a nipple shield was. He didn't know what a nipple shield was. And I don't know why I didn't send him a picture, but he comes back with Thera shells instead
Oh.
of nipple shields. And I was like, this is not the right thing. So he was as helpful as he possibly could have been.
Right.
Like he's the best. He tried to help out as much as he could.
Yeah.
And he didn't know. Now he knows a lot more because of me. But
Right.
back then he was just as clueless as I was.
Right. He was doing his best, though.
Yeah,
He was willing to go get those nipple shields.
Yeah, it was the blind leading the blind. So
Right.
I was like, okay. Yeah, so even the pediatrician, like nobody was thinking like, okay, let's help. And I guess I wasn't really pushing it that much because I was just like, okay, if it doesn't work out, I'm fine to give her formula and bottle feed her. At the time I was a little bit sad that our nursing journey didn't work out, but I was like, I'm just going to feed my baby so she can eat and just feed her whatever she needs to be fed so she can eat. Yeah, so that was our nursing journeys. And if you want, I can jump to figuring out maybe why she was having those complications.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to segue, before we segue to that, I just want to note that it because we have so many other ways to feed babies, whether that's moving to exclusively pumping if people are able to keep up their milk supply that way, or feeding formula in a bottle, we forget that when a baby is not able to transfer milk at the breast, which evolutionarily mammals should be able to do that. So if mammal babies, human babies, aren't able to do that, why are we not tagging that as indicative of something going on? And we should be really digging into trying to help this family figure this out instead of just, and I'm not talking about the families, I'm talking about providers. Instead of just moving on and saying, all right, let's just feed your baby, like baby has to gain weight. In the same way that if a baby isn't meeting other milestones, rolling over, holding up their head, starting to sit up, walking, like those are milestones that the pediatrician checks for. And if babies aren't meeting those milestones, eventually within a certain amount of time, then we start to think something might be off here. But we don't treat being able to feed from the body as a mammalian milestone, which it is. That's how mammals are supposed to eat. We just treat it as, okay, we have another way to feed. And so the fact that so many babies aren't figuring it out is indicative of a real difficulty, a real problem, and we should be treating this as another milestone. And it shouldn't be that we're just sending families home to navigate it on their own without help.
Yeah, so speaking of hitting milestones, Daisy, as a baby and up until forever, she has always been delayed with those milestones. She was always delayed by like a month or two, and she always caught up, but it was always like she's not hitting these milestones when she's supposed to. Jumping forward, when right before Daisy turned 4 years old, she had been in early intervention from about almost 2 to when she turned 3. And early intervention only did so much for us, and eventually the pandemic happened and everything moved to being virtual and online. And unfortunately, that did nothing for us.
It's so hard for littles. Yeah.
The virtual was like she wanted nothing to do with it. So she did get an assessment, and they were like, well, she doesn't like really meet the criteria for being diagnosed with autism, but she obviously has all of these delays and there's some underlying issues going on here. So they suggested that we get genetic testing done. And I was like, can you give me like more reasoning for like genetic tests? Is there something that you guys are thinking? And I was like, I don't really want to put her through that if we don't have, can you give me like a reason why you're suggesting that? And nobody could really say why. They're like, she doesn't have autism, so just get genetic testing done. And then one day, my aunt, I don't know how she found the article, it was totally random, but she found an article online of another little girl who has the same name as my daughter, Daisy, who has Williams syndrome. And she sent the article to me. And I read the article, and there was no picture of this little girl. It was just describing everything about this little girl, her mannerisms. It described her facial features. It described the types of developmental delays that this little girl had, and like the sensory sensitivities that this little girl had. And I read it. It was literally like I was reading exactly about my daughter.
Mm.
And I was like, oh my gosh. And then I looked up pictures of people with Williams syndrome, and I was like, these children could be her siblings. Like
Mm.
she looks like that. So I showed my husband, and I said, I think that Daisy has Williams syndrome. So let's go and get genetic testing done. And something about Daisy's pediatrician is that when we first met with him, I loved him because he didn't make a big deal about a lot of stuff. And we're like that. We don't make a big deal about a lot of stuff. And we try not to work ourselves up really. And he was very, didn't make a big deal out of things. He was good at keeping us calm and being like, everything is fine, everything is fine. And he's an endocrinologist. So how he didn't catch for almost 4 years that Daisy has Williams syndrome, because Williams syndrome, if you don't know what it is, it's a genetic condition that presents at birth. It's caused by the spontaneous deletion of 26 to 28 genes on chromosome number 7. It happens randomly at the time of conception. It's not something that my husband or I passed down to Daisy. It just randomly happened. Yeah. And people with Williams syndrome they have developmental delays typically. They can have various health complications. Specifically, the main one is heart defects, and Daisy has very mild aortic stenosis. So I think that's a reason, because she has always been so healthy, like physically healthy. I think that is a reason why it didn't really get caught, because a lot of babies get diagnosed with Williams syndrome right after they're born because they have a heart defect and they need that immediate care to deal with their heart. And Daisy didn't present with any of the typical health issues that people with Williams syndrome have. So I think that is another big reason why she didn't get diagnosed for so long. So we sought out genetic testing on our own, and we took her to UMass Memorial in Worcester, and we met with a geneticist there. And I said, I'm almost positive that my daughter has Williams syndrome. So when you draw her blood and you're looking for that, or you're looking for anything, like I really think that's a thing that she has. And they did her blood work. They called us back and they were like, you are right. She does have Williams syndrome. And then they were like, let's get you set up with seeing a cardiologist. Let's get an ultrasound of her kidneys. Let's do some other things to see if she has any of these health complications that do typically come along with Williams syndrome. So she, like any disability, there's a spectrum of, does somebody have a disability more on like the milder end, or is it more severe? Daisy is more on like the milder end of that spectrum. Her biggest thing is like the developmental delays. And now that we know that she has Williams syndrome and we've been able to get her the right help, she's really just done so well. She's been in preschool for 2.5 years. She gets speech therapy, occupational therapy, and physical therapy. So now that we know and we've been able to actually help her, she has really come a long way. And something that, when I think back to when she was a baby and the fact that she does have Williams syndrome, I think that was possibly a reason why we had a lot of issues nursing, because something like infants with Williams syndrome can experience feeding issues due to the fact that they have low muscle tone in their lips and their cheeks and their tongue. So they have issues with the ability to coordinate sucking and swallowing while they're feeding. That's something that's common in infants, and even children can sometimes have issues feeding. We haven't noticed now that she's older any issues with her eating or drinking or anything, but kind of look back and I'm like, maybe that is one of the reasons why we had such a hard time. And the fact that like latching wasn't going very well, it might have just been because the muscle tone in her mouth area was, she had that low muscle tone, and maybe that's why she had issues latching.
Absolutely.
But
Yeah.
I just look back and I'm like, I don't understand how literally nobody who ever saw her
Mm-hmm.
was like, maybe she has Williams syndrome and maybe she has a developmental disability. And we could
Mm-hmm.
have gotten the help that we needed back then, because she was also a very fussy baby. Like,
Mm.
I I think she only ever cried as a baby. She
Yeah.
cried so much and she only ever wanted to be held. And that was hard on me and hard on my husband too. And it was like we just had to figure out life with this baby that always cried all the time.
And
And
did
that
she
was hard.
cry even when she was being held, or if she was being held, it
Um
wasn't as bad?
if she was being held, it wasn't that bad, but it was like I was constantly holding her. Like somebody
Right.
had to be constantly holding
Right.
her. And I
Yeah.
never noticed that she ever had issues eating out of a bottle. So
Okay.
I don't know, but yeah, I
Yeah.
just, the fact that she later in life got diagnosed with Williams syndrome just makes me think back to when she was a baby and thinking like maybe that's why we had all of the
Oh,
issues that we had.
absolutely. And babies with low muscle tone do struggle more with nursing, but there are ways that it can be counteracted if a family wants to continue nursing. Now,
Mhm.
sometimes what families need to hear is your baby has low muscle tone, and low muscle tone does make it more difficult for the baby to nurse. So, would you like ways to continue some sort of nursing relationship, whether that's all nursing or sometimes nursing? There are some ways to help your baby nurse with low muscle tone. Or knowing this, would you like to say, you know what, my baby does fine on a bottle. Now I know why it's hard to nurse. So I'm just going to switch.
Yeah, and we
Um,
had none of that.
so sometimes all you need is the answer and then you can make an informed decision. But when you don't have the answer and you think, "Oh my gosh, I'm failing my baby. Like why won't my baby nurse? They're supposed to be able to do this." And it takes an IBCLC cannot diagnose Williams syndrome. Obviously, that's not within our scope. But an IBCLC can do a suck evaluation and say, you know what, your baby's really struggling to maintain a suck, even on my finger, and I'm noticing that the tone is really weak and that they're not able to maintain that. I really think that you should and send those notes to the pediatrician. Like I did a suck evaluation, they are not able to maintain a latch for very long, and there's things that we can do with our finger in the mouth to move it laterally and to move it in ways to see how long they can maintain that suck, moving it forwards and backwards to see what's going on with that baby's latch and how long can they hold it given different scenarios.
Mhm.
And so if somebody had taken a minute to listen to you and to hear what your difficulties were and to say, okay, I'm hearing this. I hear how difficult it is. Let me see if I can provide you any sort of answers as to why it's so difficult. And then send that note off to the pediatrician so that they could provide you even more answers. You could have maybe gotten answers before your daughter was a
Oh,
preschooler.
yeah, almost 4.
Yeah.
I know. How do you go almost 4 years with a developmental disability and not get any diagnosis or help? Thank God that she does not have any major health complications and that her heart like wasn't having these like really big and bad issues, because she didn't have a heart murmur. I think that's why nobody really caught on.
Kayla talked about what it was like for her to struggle without a diagnosis for over 4 years, knowing that her child was struggling and not knowing how to help her. And then she gave some really great advice that can apply to all parents, regardless of whether or not your child has a disability or some other sort of diagnosis. So listen in.
And I think like people who do have children with disabilities, we need to give ourselves grace and say, I love my child. I love everything about them. They are perfect to me. And this is very difficult, and I'm having a hard time. And you look around at other parents with children who are typical children, and you do think to yourself, like, why is my child not as easy as them? Why is my child giving me such a hard time? Why am I not handling this very well?
Mm.
Why am I having such a hard time? But at the end of the day, I think you just have to say, I'm not getting the help that I need, or it's okay. It's okay. Just being a parent in general, it's okay if you're having a hard time some days and you need a break from your child, or you need just to, I don't know, just say parenting is hard. At the end of the day, parenting is hard.
Yes, and if
Let's give ourselves
sometimes
grace.
right, and if sometimes the best you can do is let your kids watch TV all day while you sit on the couch and
Hmm.
decompress, then that's fine too.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so then tell me how this whole experience of being brought into the birth world and recognizing how your experience could have been better changed really the course of your life and how you wanted to change how other people experience birth and postpartum.
Yeah, so when Daisy was about 2 years old, I watched the documentary, The Business of Being Born, and I was like, oh, so I probably could have had a way better experience if I had a doula, and maybe if I had different care providers, or maybe if I just had people who like could advocate for me, or if I just knew, even if I just knew more, like maybe things could have been different. And then I started really looking into being a doula, and I was like, this makes a lot of sense for me, actually. I was a volunteer on the Postpartum Support International Warm Line for a year before I became a doula, and that helped me even more. Just be like, I really enjoy doing this. I love helping people. I've been around babies my whole life, and I've also been around sexual and reproductive health my whole life. I have always been, my mom, because she had me at such a young age, was always just like, I grew up with my mom. Like she was always very open with me. There was never like, we're not going to talk about that because you're too young, or we don't need to talk about that. My mom told me everything. Sometimes my mom told me stuff before I even asked or wanted to know. But the women in my family also have always had a lot of reproductive health issues, and it was never something that was really hidden from me. So reproductive health especially was something that I was very interested in. So I took my training online through Doula Trainings International to be a full spectrum doula. And after that, I immediately started taking on birth clients and postpartum clients and reproductive health clients. And I've done a lot of menstrual cycle coaching and just birth work. I've attended a handful of births since then. And it's just being able to educate people so that they know their options and they know what, not even physiological birth, because some people want to have a medicated birth, like they know that, but just being able to know all of your options and like being able to make those decisions for yourself, I just think is really great. Because I wish I was more educated when I was pregnant with Daisy, and maybe I still would have said, yeah, I still want to have an epidural, or yeah, I still want to have pain medication in my IV, or now I think back and I said, I probably did really need to be on Pitocin. I would have stayed home a little bit longer, and I would have waited longer and just said, okay, let's go and have maybe an appointment the next day just to check and make sure baby is okay. But I probably would have waited, and I probably would have said, okay, let me not lay in bed the entire time I'm in labor and actually get up and do something to
Yeah,
try
and
to
tell
get things
people
moving.
no cervical checks, please,
Yes,
or
exactly. No, sir, don't stick your fingers inside of me because my water is broken and you're going to make me and my baby have an infection.
Mhm.
But it's, yeah, and just seeing the way that birth transforms people, it's just amazing. Being able to, even like people who are having their second or third or fourth baby, and being able to help them have a totally different birth experience no matter where they're giving birth, it's just awesome. And for a long time, we waited a very long time to try to have a second baby, and being able to help other people have positive birth experiences, I'm like, okay, I didn't get to have this super positive birth experience, so I'm going to help other people have these awesome, good birth experiences. And postpartum, being able to take care of their babies and say, parenting is hard, let's figure this out together.
Mm.
What resources can I provide you with so that you are getting the help that you need? And just being, even just some people just want to have somebody there who can listen to them and not judge them and understand and just say, yeah, that really sucks. I feel you.
Exactly.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
just
and the great thing about having a doula is any question that comes to mind, you can usually text them right then, whereas with your provider, your midwife, your OBGYN, typically you're having to store those questions in your mind and then wait till your next appointment and then hope you remember to ask them or write them down on a piece of paper. And sometimes the questions, they're not quite clinical questions, so you might be there might be just a little bit more distance between you and your provider. Whereas with your doula, you know that you can ask them the questions and they'll say, maybe you should ask your provider that, or this is how you can ask your provider that to get the right answer you need. Or they'll say, oh, yeah, here's how you can approach this, or here are your various options, or hey, let me provide you some resources so that you can start thinking about how to approach this. And they're just a wealth of knowledge, or if they don't know the answer, they have a wealth of community and resources behind them to get the answers. I'm a doula too, although I'm not working as one, but I'm a part of all these doula communities, and all the time we have people asking all these questions. So even if they haven't attended births at a hospital that you're giving birth at, for instance, they know 100 doulas who have. So they can go in and say, hey, what are the nurses like at this hospital? What are the doctors on call like from this provider group? And so even if they don't have the experience, they know lots of people who do. And that's what having a doula, it's like you have this whole community behind you when you hire that one person.
yeah, exactly, exactly. And I just, the doula community that we do have in this area, I love. I just love it. I love being a part of it. I love everyone who's in it. It's so supportive. Like, I just can't, I feel this year for me has been such a great year, like doula wise. And I really attribute that to all of the other doulas that have helped me along the way.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
Yeah. It's really
it's
great.
awesome.
Awesome. So we'll link all of your information in the show notes so that people can reach out to you for any of the services that you provide. And as we close out, I would love to know what you are hoping for when it comes to baby feeding with baby number 2. What are you
Yeah,
thinking
so
about?
I am planning to have a home birth, and I am already setting myself up. I do want to see an IBCLC after I have my baby because, yeah, I do know a little bit more now than I did back then. I know a fair amount more than I did back then. And also, I'm not a breastfeeding expert by any means. So I am definitely setting myself up this time to see an IBCLC postpartum, and maybe, like, I've read books and everything and I have a better understanding now, but I do want to see an IBCLC like in my postpartum time to get that help because I do want to feed my baby from my body for at least a year or even beyond with my next baby. And I want my daughter to be a big part, my older daughter Daisy, I want her to be a big part of that too and be able to see that and be exposed to that and just know that it's normal and
Mm-hmm.
just like any of our other bodily functions are
Yeah.
normal and natural.
Yeah,
So, yeah,
exactly. Yeah, and we can't be our own providers. Like you wouldn't be your
right.
own doula. And if I were ever to have another baby, which the only reason I would is so that I could have reels with me feeding a baby. So that's not going to happen. I would hire an IBCLC if I had difficulties because I can't be my own IBCLC. Like sometimes you just need another brain. You can't be your own midwife. So, yeah, we need people even if we do have a lot of knowledge. We need to bring people into our situation to help us.
Yeah, definitely.
Great. Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences and for educating us on Williams syndrome. And if you have any resources that you want me to link about Williams syndrome in the show notes, I'm happy to do that as well.
Sure. So May is Williams Syndrome Awareness Month.
Oh,
and
great.
so if you want to learn more about Williams syndrome, you can visit williams-syndrome.org.
Great. Thank you so much. We'll have that linked in the show notes too.
So thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Have you ever been in a situation like Kayla's? I know I have. And it can be infuriating to feel like you're just on your own trying to figure things out, especially when it all could have been figured out from the beginning with just a genetic test. So this is a good reminder for both parents and for providers, those of us who are providers like postpartum doulas or lactation professionals, to take a step back and to view the situation more holistically. And if you want to talk about these themes, join my Milk Making Minutes community group on Facebook. This is the place where we talk about such things. In fact, I had a poll going where I asked people how they discovered that they were suffering from a perinatal mood and anxiety disorder. Were they diagnosed by a professional, or did they themselves discover that what they were feeling was outside of the range of just normal postpartum difficulty? And if you want to see the results of that poll or answer the questions yourselves, please join my group. It's still up and you can go answer that question and see the fascinating results. If this podcast has meant anything to you, please take a minute to rate and review on your favorite podcasting app. It means so much to me, and it's how the word gets spread. Thanks. Bye. Hey, Jolie, what advice would you give somebody who was having difficulty feeding their baby, but the professionals they were going to weren't really helping them, like the lactation consultant they were going to, for instance?
I don't really know.
Do you think they should keep seeing that person? Should they try to find a new lactation consultant? What do you think?
A new one.
They should try to see a new one. Okay. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.